Hi, this is Scott Miller. Welcome to my Top Performance blog. Today, I have the distinct honor of speaking with Dr. Jay Van Bavel, who is a New York University professor of psychology and the director of the Social Identity and Morality Lab at the same university. Hello, Jay.
Hi, Scott. Nice to be with you today.
And hey, I really want to thank you because I know you're a busy person. You are doing an amazing amount of research. You're out and about. You've just published a new book, The Power of Us, which I think we'll get to at some point during this brief conversation. So thanks very much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and share it with as many people as I can.
You know, there are many reasons why I reached out. I follow you on Facebook, which is something I recommend all of the listeners to the Top Performance blog do. Your posts are always intriguing. They have a social psychology angle to them that I think is entirely applicable to a clinical audience as well. And one of the things you write about often, and it's really the topic, I think, in part of your new book, is about the influence of social media in modern life. And I guess we're lonely in America.
Yeah, I mean, well, we've had about 3 years where we haven't been allowed to interact with one another in the way that we normally do. So, I mean, we were going through, but even before the pandemic, what many people had called a loneliness epidemic. So there's definitely a feeling of disconnection, which is kind of surprising, given that with technology, in some ways, we're more connected than ever in human history, and yet we feel more lonely than ever.
How do we put those two things together? Because as you say, every place you look, even when I see couples at the dinner table, often it seems like they're communicating through their phones about what they are going to be ordering or something. I don't know. How does it go together? High use of social media, loneliness, polarization.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think of it is just that we have very old, ancient brains. So, right? So our brains evolved in small groups of people for almost the entirety of human history. And so we communicated in person, we sat around a campfire, we told stories, we could look people in the eye. And I mean, I love the fact that we can now connect like this virtually, but it's something that's hard for our brain to, build those same sense of connections with people because the way that we were designed was a little bit different. And so I think social media in some ways makes that much worse because we feel like we're connecting with people, but it is, I think, at a very superficial level most of the time for most of us. And so it's kind of like eating food that's empty calories. It's like you feel full, but it doesn't really like sustain you. And so I think that's a little bit what it's like. We're kind of constantly eating these empty calories.
And yet it's pretty hard to put it away. Now that you've used this analogy, I guess it is a bit like junk food. It might feel good at the moment, but really isn't fulfilling. And would you suggest that our interaction with these powerful tools also distorts things in a particular way or direction?
Yeah, I love that you use the word distorts. I like to think of social media as a little bit like a funhouse mirror. If you've ever gone to like a carnival and you walk by those mirrors and it twists your body to look like a giraffe or look like 2 feet tall. And so that's a little bit of what we're seeing when we go on social media. So we're seeing like exaggerated versions of people's perspectives in 2 ways. The first way is that, let's say we're going and having a conversation online about some moral or political issue. It's often the most extreme people who are driving the conversation. So I forget the exact data, but it's something like 10% of people produce 90% of the content on these moral and political issues. And so those people are the most extreme people with the strongest possible views. And that's why they're producing so much content. They have really strongly committed views of things. And so we're seeing that, and it might seem to us like it's a representative sliver of humanity, but in fact, it's not. And then the second thing is all of us are trying to win in this attention economy game. So I even do this where I'll post something probably more extreme than I actually believe. Or if I read an article in the newspaper, I'll pull the quote that's most provocative or interesting because I know that's more likely to get people to engage. And so I catch myself doing it, but what happens with that quote is it doesn't often represent the entire article. I'm not pulling it because it kind of like summarizes the article. I'm pulling it because it's provocative or most interesting. And so we're all sucked into this game, whether we have a blog or a book, or whether we're just trying to like have our voice be heard in a discourse about something that we saw on TV. And so this is the playground that we're all in. And then, so here's the scope of it. About 4 billion people are now on social media, And one estimate suggests that the average social media user is spending 3 hours a day on social media, and they're scrolling through about 300 feet of content every day. So if you have an iPhone with you, that means that's 6 inches tall. You've swiped down 600 times. That's the height of the Statue of Liberty. That's what you've been looking at all day. And so what pops out at you? What do you actually read? What do you engage with? It's that sliver of things that grab your attention.
And clearly this has really a strong impact. I know that in a podcast that I do with my colleague, Dan Lewis, who's an addiction medicine physician, we were looking at how science covered the pandemic via social media. And Michael Lewis made essentially a similar argument that we heard people from one extreme to the other, but we didn't hear what most scientists were saying, which was, well, we think so, but we're not exactly sure. More research needs to be done, which leads me then to the question, how best to use social media? Because one of the other posts that you had recently showed that if we could change our minds about something, and in the United States and elsewhere in the world, it would be a huge advantage if we could use this to educate, refine our thinking, make better decisions. Then we end up with better outcomes. But that doesn't seem to be the effect of interacting on social media.
Yeah, so being able to update your beliefs is probably, like, I would argue in this universe, is a superpower because it seems like so few people have it at some level. But the research on this is a little bit mixed. That people are able to respond to fact checks and update their beliefs pretty well about most things. So if you're telling me like what dish detergent to buy and you show me some good evidence that one is better than the others and cheaper, I'll go buy it. But if we're talking about whether or not I should support Roe versus Wade and abortion rights, people are very entrenched on that issue because it's a very moral and political issue and it's connected to their identity. And so you're going to have a very hard time convincing anyone about that issue, no matter what evidence you bring to the table. And so unfortunately, a lot of the conversations we're having about issues have become moralized. So you mentioned COVID. I would imagine throughout history, COVID would have been one of those things where disease is spreading, you ask your doctor or a public health expert what to do and you follow it. But COVID from the very early stages, at least in the United States, became polarized. And so Republican leaders and elites in the media were saying something different from Democratic leaders and members of the media. And so in this country right now, people really only trust sources of media and leadership on their side. And so they're not willing to often listen to the other side. And so that was a challenge throughout the pandemic. And I would argue that and our data backs that up. We've studied that very closely. And that seems to be like an identity issue that didn't exist for previous issues.
And is there a clue in there then? Because what you say initially was the research is mixed. If you're presented with facts and there isn't a strong identity or ideological component to it, people are willing to update. Yeah. But when it's tied to who we see ourselves as people, deeply held values, our worldview, those beliefs are harder to change and refine. What do we do about that? What can we do?
Yeah, so that's a hard thing. I think for some things, people will move once they get the right facts. And it's especially problematic, I think, when you have a strong identity and the facts are a bit ambiguous. And maybe the good example of that was early in the pandemic, where it looked risky, but we didn't know how bad it was going to be. And so there was a lot of ambiguity about how it might spread when it got here and what the actual mortality rate would be. And so in conditions of ambiguity, and then when identity gets connected to it, I think that's the conditions where it's hardest to change. So I'll give you an example of a case where identity could be used to change people around the pandemic.
Perfect.
So I want to be fair to Republicans here because I've seen the data. And when the country's polarized, sometimes that actually hides polarization within parties. So one of my collaborators was studying Republicans' attitudes towards the vaccine very early on, and he found it was polarized even within Republicans. So within Republicans, about 30% of people refused to get the vaccine no matter what. And 50% absolutely wanted to get it as soon as possible. And there was almost no one in the middle, even within that party, that said, oh, I'm on the fence. Most people were really extreme in their views, even within the party. There were some people who were persuadable and they were kind of waiting to see how safe it was or what their neighbors were going to do. And there was really interesting study that found that if you had the right messenger that shared an identity with Republicans, that was more effective. So for example, The leader of the National Institutes of Health in the United States is a scientist, one of the most prominent scientists in the country, and he was advocating for vaccines. But if you gave a message to Republicans pointing out that he was also Christian and took his religious beliefs very seriously, that identity and belief system that they shared, and it made them trust him more, and it moved their willingness to get vaccinated by about 5 to 10%. And so that type of sense of shared identity can build trust. And trust is really critical to believing the message that this is safe and effective for you. And so I think we need to think more about who the messengers are that are going to be most powerful in different communities, and make sure that for future public health issues that we identify and get those messengers to those communities sooner, maybe rather than relying on like single kind of messengers for the whole country, because right now we're a collection of different identities that don't all agree. And so it's really important to figure out who's going to connect with those individual communities.
You know, Jay, when you say this, I have to tell you, I find what you just said so frustrating. I find it so frustrating that I have to appeal to that level. And I get it. I understand it. I think clinicians, in many ways, I sometimes say when I'm supervising clinicians, if you want to rearrange the furniture, you have to be inside the house. There's no way to just stand at the outside, shout through the windows. They'll just close the blinds. So I get it at some level, and yet at another, I'm deeply disappointed that the facts somehow are second to who we are as people. But maybe that's just the reality.
Yeah, I mean, this is the reality of the world we live in. So I'll give you an example of how this plays out with American politics. You go back to social media. There was a study finding that people are more and more willing to put their political identity on their Twitter profile. And so for many people before, it wasn't a central identity that they wanted to project out into the world. It's increasingly become the case that people want to send it out there like a bat signal, to tell everybody who they are and to find like-minded people. And so when people are leading with a specific identity, you have to understand that that's going to be a really central thing to them, and it determines who they trust, who they're going to listen to, who they look to for role models, what norms they follow. People tend to only follow social norms within their communities. And so I'll give you an example of how this happened with social media with vaccines. Is that I'm in a community surrounded by mostly scientists. A lot of my friends are scientists. And so they were getting a vaccine and they would post about it immediately on their Facebook account. So my Facebook newsfeed was full for a couple months of just people getting their vaccine and how excited they were, showing their shoulder with the Band-Aid on it during the early days of the COVID vaccine. And I have friends who are Republican and live in conservative and Republican neighborhoods. And even if they got vaccinated, they couldn't tell anybody because they didn't want to be ostracized or stigmatized in their community. They knew it was going to upset so many people that it would have social consequences for them. And so that made it hard for them to share information that might have been useful for vaccine hesitant people in those communities to see, oh, I do have friends who got it. It's safe and I should get it too. But they're not seeing the same information in those communities because there's enough animosity that they don't even feel comfortable sharing it, even though they got it. And so that's kind of the dynamic, I think, that you have to understand what's happening in those communities. Actually a little bit complex. And there are people on board, but they don't feel comfortable coming out with it, especially in public ways or on social media, because they're worried about the backlash that they would get, or that their kids, for one woman I know, she is a mother of 2 kids. She's worried her kids would stop getting invited to social events if she insisted they wore a mask. And so you have to understand that the dynamics are actually complex in these communities. You kind of got to get on the ground and talk to people to see what they are and figure out how to solve them.
Okay. And going from the sort of nomothetic, this aggregate and group conversations, to the individual, I'm a person and I need to change my mind. And I'm thinking specifically within a clinical context. Our group has been providing feedback on an ongoing basis to psychotherapists about the client's experience, whether or not the client thinks they're making progress, whether engaged fully in what the therapist is saying. It's interesting to me that our own research and the research of many other researchers around the world indicates that providing that type of feedback isn't always effective at changing what the therapist does. And I can see identity components in this, especially if what the client, for example, is asking is for direct advice. For many therapists, that's going to be sort of taboo. You never give direct advice, when in fact that may be the shortest distance between 2 points and the very thing the client wants. How do we apply some of the insights that you have from your own research to such a context, changing our individual minds, et cetera?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot to unpack here. One of the big things in terms of people's willingness to change their mind is that they feel they're in a what's called a psychologically safe environment where they can be heard, but also they can speak up and get feedback. And so I think that's one of the environments, obviously, that from a clinical perspective, that's obviously the environment for the most part that you're trying to create. And then part of that is how that messaging is delivered. And so one of the things we talk about in our book, and it's not necessarily in a clinical sense, but it's in all kinds of group environments, is to create a sense of shared purpose, that you're working on something together. You use language and rhetoric that signals you're working on it together. So for example, leaders who use the word we and us are more likely to actually, like, for example, get people on board with them, or politicians who do that are more likely to win elections. But there actually is a collective also in a clinical context. And I actually just gave a talk at the Canadian Psychological Association on Sunday on my book. And I had a couple clinicians come up to me after, they wanted autographs for the book. And then they were saying, the language section you have on language is something that I use in my clinical practice to create a sense of shared purpose, and we're working together and I'm there with my client and we have a goal, and it's not me different from them, that this goal is we're on this journey together to help them. And so they actually said that resonated with them in their own practice. I don't want to tell every clinician to do it. I realize people have different approaches and styles and backgrounds and philosophies, but that would be something that I heard resonated with that type of audience. And I know from the research suggests it resonates with people who are hearing feedback and information.
Two really important pieces. One is creating that safe psychological space, both in the clinic room and perhaps in the supervision group that the clinician might be attending, a space where they can talk openly about their concerns, explore new ideas. The second piece, really important, a language which suggests the shared purpose that they're both involved in. If it's me fixing you, well, that doesn't sound like a shared purpose as much as us figuring out where to go forward from here.
Yeah. And that's the message that people want to be part of. People want to know that people are working with them and that they're on a trajectory together, and that they can trust the other person to give them advice and feedback that's going to help them get there. And it sounds from what you had said that that's what they're asking for, explicit advice in some cases.
Yeah.
And so it does seem clearly that people want that.
Can I ask you one last question, Jay? And that is, are you hopeful?
So I would say this. I'm so dispositionally hopeful and optimistic that my wife accuses me all the time of being too Canadian, or too not. That's her term for it. So I am hopeful. However, I have to say that in the last few years, my hope has heavily eroded about a lot of the things I study, about polarization's gotten worse and intergroup conflict in the US. I mean, we mishandled the pandemic here worse than pretty much any other country on earth. So it's hard to have faith in leadership and institutions when that happens. I have less faith. I used to have faith that, and you can go back to my interviews from 5 years ago when I started studying social media, and I would say the good things might be that maybe at the flick of a button, a CEO can change messaging to 1 billion people and send more factual, accurate information or something. But I haven't seen that happen. I haven't seen those leaders step up, and they have a lot of power. They seem to be more committed to just using algorithms that maximize profit, even if they have negative consequences for society. And so a lot of things that I study have led me to a point of, I would call it, informed pessimism at this point.
Okay.
But I have to say, one of the last 8 months since my book came out, I've been having a lot of conversations with people like yourself and regular people when I go to events and talk to them. And that's actually what makes me optimistic. What makes me optimistic is people who are reading and thinking about these things and struggling to fix them, and creating platforms like yours to share to other people and to kind of mobilize a shared understanding about how we can leverage these things for good. So the main thrust of my research and the main point of my book, I think, if I had one, was that groups and identities can be a force for division, conflict, discrimination, and the spread of misinformation, but they can also be a force for moral generosity and support and help and change and solidarity and great leadership. And so my main mission now, and I think going forward, this is even more of my mission, is to try to give people the tools to do that. Because people are leaders at all kinds of different levels, whether you're coaching your daughter's soccer team, you're running a clinical practice, you're in the C-suite of some big business. All of those people have influence and mechanisms that they can use to change the communities that they're in and that they oversee, change the norms, change the rhetoric, change the way we work together. And so I think that to me has just given me a constant wellspring of hope. Like every conversation, every time I open the news or social media, I get depressed. And then every time I have these conversations and know that there's people reading this and thinking about this and engaging with it, that gives me hope.
And
so you give me hope, Scott.
Well, thanks for that. And one key thing you said is if I'm not misunderstanding this, is you set the social media down and you actually had conversations with people.
Yeah.
And I think I saw it in your feed, a study that suggested if you just cut out an hour of social media, wasn't that you?
Yeah, so there was a study about a month ago that came out, I'm glad you remember it, that they assigned people to just reduce their social media, not eliminate it, and their well-being was higher. Almost just as high as people who quit it completely. And actually, I had just done that this spring myself, where I used to have social media, and I'm on way too many social media platforms. So I had on my phone, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and I would scroll through them every day, see what was posted, see who commented, share stuff. And it was causing me too much stress, and I realized I was doom scrolling, where I'd just be lying on the couch after I put my kids to bed, just scrolling on one, then scrolling on the other, then looping back in this terrible doom loop and doing nothing. And it wasn't, and I go to bed all like dejected and annoyed. And I just deleted those from my phone on a trip in March. And I have felt better ever since. And I still use them all. Yeah. I'll log into them from my computer, but just removing them from my phone meant that I can't just habitually do it. Yeah. Almost like I was thinking, wow. I'm always reluctant to use the term addiction here because I know it's controversial, but someone who has a nicotine addiction, they're always reaching for their smoke. And so you have to get them in context, and with people, they're not used to doing that, or it just triggers them to do it. And so my phone, I think, was a trigger for me to do that. Every time I check my email, then I'd hit all my social medias.
Yeah.
And by just eliminating that one element of my life has made a world of difference, and I won't be going back. And the data now suggests that I made the right decision. So it's not just me, I don't think.
Perfect, Jay. The power of us. You can find a link in the description of this video and along the bottom of the screen. Jay, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me and the clinicians I work with.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks to everybody else who's trying to make a difference in the world.
If I search, will